There's a lot that goes into creating a successful drag race car. There's design and engineering, there's having the right driver, the right funding, and ultimately the right basic principles in its construction. Throughout the sport's great eras of experimentation in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, there were a few successful designs that helped to create the look and feel of the sport we know today. But there were far more machines that tried and failed to change the game. In this video, we're going to look back at 5 cars which did make their mark on the drag racing landscape, but instead of making it due to gleaming success, they'll forever live in infamy because of their failures. In one case, the fundamental flaws were corrected, but in most of the others, the mistakes made in their creation led to them becoming paperweights, or worse, scrap iron. Let's start by going back to 1971 and looking at the Syndicate, the twin-engine, front-motor, top-fuel dragster. As most hardcore lovers of drag racing history know, the early 1970s were a time of revolution in top-fuel drag racing. While there had always been rear-engine dragsters in the sport, the debut of Don Garlett's car at the start of the 1971 season, Swamp Rat 14, marked the definitive beginning of the end of the slingshot dragster as the premier style of acceleration machine in the top rank of the sport. One team was late receiving the word, apparently, and they debuted one of the largest, and definitely the last ever, freshly built, twin-engine, front-motor, top-fuel dragster the world would ever see. The Syndicate team of Forthman, Raitt, Budarak, and Dittmar of California had been reasonably successful campaigners of a single-engine slingshot in the 1960s. And in 1971, they commissioned Race Car Specialties to build them the car they felt would take them to the front of the pack. The machine that left RCS was a behemoth. The car had an amazing 250-inch wheelbase. It packed 2 blown 392 Hemis on nitro, and it was effectively a dinosaur from the second it hit the racetrack. The additional engine did not overcome the weight disadvantage it brought to the table, and after competing for most of the 71 season and the very start of the 72 season, it was retired, never to be seen again. I really wish I could give you more details into what the car's actual performance numbers were, but frankly, none really exists. We only know the fact that it was not competitive, and the guys scrapped the idea when they knew they would never be able to get around the disadvantages of weight and physics that their car exhibited. Thankfully, the car was recreated in perfect period form and exists as a Cacklefest car now, perfect right down to the wing and the beautiful paint job. As an example of the car's massive size, this car was a full 3 feet longer than the 215-inch wheelbase Don Garlett's used in Swamp Rat 14, the machine that revolutionized the sport and rendered their car obsolete before it had ever turned a tire in anger. Now let's move back to 1965 to talk about the LA Plymouth dealer's Hemi Barracuda. In previous videos, we've looked at the truly insane 1965 season with respect to the rocket-like evolution of the Nitro Funny car. Once again, we look at that same year. But this time we look at a car that did something few, if any others had done at that point in the sport's still nascent history. It took flight. Lou Baney was relatively new to the ranks of the LA Plymouth Dealers Group in 1965, but he was not new to drag racing or hot rodding, and he certainly understood the marketing potential that a nitro-powered Plymouth could bring to the youth of Southern California. Rather than simply copy Bob Sullivan's idea of putting a top-fuel engine in the nose of the car, he got with the crew of B&M Automotive, specifically Bob and Don Spar, to build the car with the engine in the back. No, this was not intended to be a wheel stander, but it was intended to be the fastest full-bodied car in the world on the drag strip. The car was left 100% stock with regard to its exterior. It used a tube axle and leaf springs under the front end and an engine that sat in a cradle in the rear. That cradle was solidly mounted to the frame with no suspension. The engine was a real ground pounder built by the legendary Dave Zuschel, and during the car's first outing at the 1965 Winter Nationals, things were going along pretty well. They were slowly leaning on the 426 Hemi, and as they did so, the car went quicker and faster each time down the Pomona Strip. They were running about 140 miles an hour after a handful of runs at the Winter Nationals. Unfortunately, the car's next outing at Lyons Drag Strip a short time later would end in absolute disaster. As driver Tom McEwen left the starting line, pushing the car harder than ever down the drag strip, it achieved a speed of some 150 miles an hour before taking flight in front of an astonished crowd. A late-run wheel stand caused air to build up under the machine, and despite the efforts of McEwen to smash the brake pedal and heave the parachute out, the car flew into the air, barrel-rolled like a fighter jet, and landed on the roof. The machine skidded through the lights on its roof at nearly 140 miles an hour. The protracted roof slide managed to set the headliner of the car on fire. Before coming to a complete stop, the machine rolled another time or two, snapping off 3 of the 4 wheels, but ultimately stopping right side up. Utterly destroyed, the machine did protect McEwen. He was able to walk away from the spectacular and theretofore unseen style of wreck. But believe it or not, the story doesn't stop there. After much lobbying, Bainey talked the dealers into building another Hemi-Cuda. The next version had a blocked-off front grille, a vented rear window, and more importantly had revised suspension on all 4 corners. The front end was lowered, giving the car a downward rake. The rear cradle, which had held the engine, was now suspended and pivoted in such a way that it forced the front end of the car down under acceleration rather than trying to lift it upwards. McEwen, proving his superhuman levels of courage, drove the second version of this car as well. Now this time the car was able to clip off mid-9-second runs with speeds over 160 miles an hour. McEwen drove the car for the majority of the '66 season, when it was then taken over by another legend in the form of fearless Fred Goski. Living up to his nom de guerre, Goski ran the car exceptionally hard, nearly making it to 200 miles per hour, and most impressively earning a win at the vaunted 1967 Hot Rod Magazine meet. In the final round, Goski ran 8:56 at 186 miles an hour to win the 2,400-pound supercharged experimental stock class. He beat Gas Ronda, who was driving a camera-powered Ford Mustang. So in the end, maybe this one wasn't such a big failure anyway. Next, we go to 1971 and the U.S. Nationals to talk about Connie Kalitta driving Poncho Renans' Wedge rear-engine top fuel dragster. Of all the weird aerodynamic eras in top fuel racing, the Wedge era of the early 70s was the weirdest. The Wedge cars were built by a number of chassis builders and tried by some of the biggest names in the sport, all the way up to Don Prudhomme. Every single one of them was a dismal failure, but none of them failed as bad as the one Connie Kalitta tried to drive at the U.S. Nationals in 1971. As the story goes, fellow Michigander and well-known car owner Poncho Renan came to the 1971 Nationals with a brand-new Wedge-style top fuel dragster. These machines had normal-looking front ends, but used huge triangular-shaped sponsons that started at the driver's area and kind of ran up over the rear tires to produce more grip and supposedly more stability. Kalitta, who was at the Nationals to primarily run his funny car, along with that of Shirley Muldowney, who he was involved with on a personal level, was supposedly approached by Renan in the staging lanes and offered the seat of the race car. This happened on Thursday at the Nationals, and Kalitta took the offer to drive what would be the first rear-engine car of his career, and boy would it be a fateful decision. According to reports from people on the scene, as Kalitta was making his way down the track, he had to pedal the race car. When he pedaled the car, the Detroit locker unit in the rear end of the machine became unlocked, sending all of its power to one wheel and sending Kalitta on the ride of his life. The car wrecked mercilessly at the top end and then proceeded to strike the signage and wind light indicator at the finish line, being decimated in the process. The photos of this crash are indescribable. The only portion left intact in this whole car was the area Kalitta was sitting in. While he was transported to the hospital, he would make it back to the track the next day, he would qualify his funny car, and make it all the way to the semifinal round of competition, where he would lose to Ed McCulloch, the man who would go on to win the U.S. Nationals in 1971. The Wedge cars, if not already on the way out by now, were written off pretty quickly after this disaster. Now we go to 1967 and talk about the Ford Super Mustang. There are so many aerodynamically based failures in the 1950s and 60s of drag racing. Why choose this one? Well, honestly, it's because of whose name's attached. During the total performance era of Ford, when they came into a motorsport, they typically came in with budget and resources that were designed to vaporize the competition at any cost. And at this time in history, their drag racing program was starting to shape up in this way. They were investing heavily in their Cobra Jet program, which would go on to be very strong. The single overhead cam engines were proving to be a horsepower match for the Hemis, but they were lacking in durability versus the Chryslers. So this being said, when a group of engineers decided to tackle the issue of building the ultimate dragster, they dove all in, even though this car was supposedly built, quote, off the books from Ford's knowledge. How so many smart people could get this assignment so wrong seems absolutely unbelievable to me. There was a lot of advanced reporting about this Ford super weapon for the drag strip that was coming. It would be full of cutting-edge ideas. The body had been designed in a wind tunnel. And hey, if these guys could take on Enzo Ferrari on what amounted to his home turf, they should have no problem handling the hot rodders on theirs, right? Wrong. The Super Mustang was anything but. When the car showed up at the 1967 Winter Nationals, it was beautiful and space-age to look at, but the major problem showed up the first time Tom McEwen hit the gas. Using an injected rather than supercharged engine of more than 500 cubic inches, the car was forced to run in AA fuel dragster against the blown machines. The Super Mustang had an independent rear suspension, coilover shocks, an anti-roll bar. and that body was weighing it down like a man trying to swim with a cinder block around his neck. The car produced high 8-second elapsed times in an era when dragsters were already running in the low 7s. The machine was beautiful, but woefully slow. And beyond that, the cool-looking bubble top it had forced a driving position that McEwen described as nightmarish. He was squashed into the cage so tight he effectively didn't even fit in the car. The car was basically never seen again after the '67 Winter Nationals, and 6 months after its big-time debut, complete with a CarCraft cover shoot, it was parked in a Ford warehouse, never to race again. Thankfully, the beautiful machine was saved, has been completely restored, and resides in a car collection. And last but not least, we go to 1972 to talk about Gary Gabelich's mid-engined, monocoque, four-wheel drive, Vega station wagon nitro funny car. Gary Gabelich is one of the true heroes of American speed that deserves his own full biographical video, and eventually I plan to do just that. But for now we have to look at the most ghastly and reckless machine that he ever drove. Saying that is something for a guy who had driven a rocket car to the world's land speed record in 1970, traveling more than 622 miles an hour. On top of that, this is a guy who had been a test jumper for the Rockwell Corporation during the space race, leaping out of capsules on the edge of the Earth's atmosphere. The dude was fearless. His machine was, on paper, the most advanced drag racing car ever made, certainly up to the point of 1972. It was four-wheel drive, had an aluminum monocoque-style chassis, used a blown, nitro-burning Hemi built by Ed Pink mounted midships, and sat just 41 inches tall at the roofline. It was also the most expensive drag racing car ever built to that point in history, carrying the modern price tag of more than $238,000. Paul Sutherland and Al Willard at Sutherland's Race Car Works built the car, and it was truly like nothing that had been created before or since in the sport of drag racing. Unfortunately, their mechanical masterpiece would have one of the most ignominious ends in the sport's history. During a closed session at Orange County International Raceway designed for media members to see the car for the first time and get some action shots of the machine doing burnouts, complete disaster struck. Depending on which account you read, the car did an awesome four-wheel burnout, and then either the throttle stuck upon launch, or Gabelich decided to take the car on its first true run. Either way, the result was the same. As four-wheel drive drag racing cars tend to do, the machine shot across the racetrack, smashed into the guardrail on one side, blasted across to the other side, suffered another titanic impact, and now on fire, the car flipped and rolled to a stop, completely destroyed in the middle of the racetrack. With only a small group of friends and no medical personnel on hand, Gabelich's life was in danger. He had a compound fractured leg, and one of his hands was severed to the point that only the skin kept it tethered to his body. Loaded into a friend's station wagon, Gabelich was sped to the hospital. In a stroke of good luck, a surgeon who specialized in attaching severed extremities was able to get his hand back attached. His leg was so broken that metal rods were inserted to make it whole again. It would be the last truly serious race car Gabelich would ever sit in. The car was not repaired, and no one has yet attempted a similar design of drag racing car in any form or fashion. Sure, there have been a few good four-wheel drive cars out there, but none of them were four-wheel drive, monocoque chassis, mid-mounted engine. This one truly seems like an idea that should never, ever be replicated. Perhaps the most interesting part of drag racing history is that it's one built on failure. A racer's failure to win causes he or she to try something new. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. A design's failure to be competitive drives other racers to shy away from it and seek a more normal path. In the end, these failures have delivered us to the ideas and concepts we see in modern drag racing today. Many people have opinions on how homogenized modern drag racing categories have become from top to bottom. But the simple fact is, the cars look the way they look, perform the way they perform, and are driven the way they drive today because these are the designs that work. The Wild West nature of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s in drag racing will never be repeated, and innovation in modern times tends to happen on an incremental basis. But smart people out there wake up every day and envision ways to go quicker and faster than we ever have before. The sport of drag racing isn't done innovating, it's just doing it in a more clandestine fashion, and one that you really have to pay attention to notice. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more historical and automotive content.